The cleaner was fired for theft, and the millionaire saw the photo in her bag. It was the same as his beloved's before disappearing 25 years ago. Ashley Carter's days began the same way, every day, without fail. Her small apartment in Queens came alive with the sound of an old coffee maker sputtering to life as the first rays of sunlight seeped through the blinds. Her son, Ethan, still half asleep, sat at the kitchen table, munching on a bowl of cereal while Ashley hurriedly tied her apron around her waist. "Mom, don't forget, it's career day tomorrow," Ethan said, his voice muffled by the cereal spoon. Ashley paused, a slight frown appearing on her face. She had nearly forgotten. "I'll try, sweetheart, but you know work's been busy," she said, planting a quick kiss on his forehead. She didn't have the heart to tell him that she couldn't imagine standing in front of his classmates, talking about her job as a housekeeper. Her mornings were a blur, dropping Ethan off at school before catching the subway to Manhattan. The contrast between her modest life and the grandeur of the city never failed to amaze her. She worked at a sprawling mansion on the Upper East Side, cleaning the glittering chandeliers and polished marble floors of a home she could never dream of living in. But Ashley wasn't bitter. She took pride in her work, finding solace in her small victories, the satisfaction of a perfectly cleaned room or the gratitude of her employer, Brian Wallace, the mansion's owner. Brian was different from the other wealthy people Ashley had encountered, despite his wealth. He was kind and approachable, always greeting her with a polite smile. Not everyone shared Brian's demeanor, though. Norma, the house's longtime head housekeeper, seemed to have it out for Ashley. Whether it was a misplaced towel or a smudge on the window, Norma always found something to criticize. One afternoon, as Ashley dusted the library shelves, she couldn't help but overhear Norma muttering to another maid, "She's too friendly with Mr. Wallace, always trying to catch his attention. Mark my words, she'll be trouble." Ashley's chest tightened, but she bit her tongue. Confronting Norma would only make things worse. Besides, she had bigger worries, like keeping Ethan safe and giving him the life he deserved. What Norma didn't know, and what Ashley herself barely understood, was the weight of the small photograph she kept tucked in her wallet. It was the only thing Ashley had left of her mother, a woman she barely remembered. The picture showed a beautiful young woman with kind eyes, holding a baby. Ashley. The edges of the photo were worn, the ink faded, but it was Ashley's most treasured possession. Growing up in foster care, Ashley had learned to rely on herself. She never knew why her mother had disappeared, and the unanswered questions left a hollow ache in her heart. But she had long since buried those feelings, focusing instead on the life she was building for Ethan. Still, there were nights when Ashley would pull out the photo and stare at it, wondering who her mother had been and why she had left. That evening, as Ashley returned home, Ethan greeted her with his usual enthusiasm. "Guess what, Mom? I told my teacher you're coming to career day." Ashley managed a smile, even as her stomach churned with anxiety. She didn't want to let Ethan down, but the thought of standing in front of a classroom filled with curious eyes made her palms sweat. "All right, Ethan, I'll be there," she said softly. Ruffling his hair, Ethan beamed, his excitement lighting up the room. For him, Ashley would do anything, even face her own insecurities. The next day at work, as Ashley polished the silverware in the dining room, Brian walked in. "Ashley, I just wanted to say thank you. The house has been spotless lately. Your hard work hasn't gone unnoticed." His words warmed her heart. "Thank you, Mr. Wallace. That means a lot," she replied, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Norma watched from the doorway, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes glinted with a dangerous mix of jealousy and disdain. Later that day, as Ashley cleaned the guest bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She turned to find Norma standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Don't get too comfortable," Norma said coldly. "People like us don't belong in places like this. You'd do well to remember that." Ashley swallowed hard, refusing to let Norma's words get under her skin. She had worked too hard and come too far to let someone like Norma tear her down. As she headed home that evening, Ashley couldn't help but replay Norma's words in her mind. "People like us." Ashley had heard that phrase her whole life, always spoken with the same condescension. But Ashley refused to let it define her. She pulled out the photo of her mother, tracing the outline of the woman's face with her thumb. "I don't know who you were," Ashley whispered to herself, "but I hope you'd be proud of me." With that, She slipped the photo back into her wallet, squared her shoulders, and prepared herself for whatever tomorrow might bring. Ashley's morning at the mansion began like any other, with a bucket of cleaning supplies in one hand and a checklist in the other. The air smelled of fresh coffee and lavender polish as she moved through the sunlit halls. But there was an unusual tension in the house that day, something Ashley couldn't quite put her finger on. Norma's sharp voice cut through the calm as she barked orders at the staff, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I want every room spotless for tonight's dinner, no excuses," she snapped, her tone more curt than usual. Ashley avoided eye contact, keeping her head down as she dusted the ornate vases in the main living room. She had learned to stay out of Norma's way when the older woman was in one of her moods. By mid-morning, Ashley was assigned to clean the master bedroom, a task she found oddly personal. As she straightened the bed and wiped down the furniture, her gaze wandered to a set of framed photographs on the dresser. There were pictures of Brian with his late wife, Donna, and a young woman who must have been her in her youth. Ashley paused, feeling a strange tug in her chest as she stared at Donna's kind smile. For a moment, she let herself wonder if her own mother had looked at her the same way, lost in thought. Ashley didn't notice Norma enter the room until the woman cleared her throat. "Daydreaming on the job, are we?" Norma said, her voice dripping with disdain. Ashley quickly turned back to her work. "Sorry, I was just finishing up here," she replied, her tone polite but firm. Norma smirked. "I'm sure you were. That afternoon." Ashley moved on to the dining room to polish the silverware for the evening's dinner. She worked diligently, her focus on making every piece gleam under the chandelier's light. But as she stepped back to admire her work, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Something felt off. Minutes later, Norma stormed into the room, holding a delicate necklace in her hand. "Ashley, this was found in the supply closet. Care to explain why it's hidden there?" Ashley blinked, confused. "I don't know how it got there. I've never seen it before," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Norma's expression hardened. "How convenient Mr. Wallace trusted you, and this is how you repay him, stealing from his home." Ashley's cheeks burned with humiliation as the other staff members gathered in the doorway, whispering among themselves. "I didn't take it," Ashley said firmly, meeting Norma's gaze. "I would never." "You expect us to believe that?" Norma interrupted, her voice rising. "I've warned Mr. Wallace about you, and now he'll see the truth for himself." Brian arrived moments later, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's going on here?" Norma held up the necklace. "This was found hidden in the supply closet. I believe Ashley has been stealing." Ashley's heart pounded as she turned to Brian. "I didn't take it, Mr. Wallace, I swear. I don't even know where that necklace came from." Brian studied her face for a long moment. Ashley could see the doubt flicker in his eyes, and it cut her deeper than Norma's accusations ever could. "I think it's best if you take some time away from the house." "Ashley," Brian said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Until we can sort this out." Ashley's chest tightened, but she nodded, too shocked and hurt to argue. She quickly gathered her belongings, keeping her head high even as tears threatened to spill as she stepped out of the mansion. Her trembling hands clutched her bag tightly. The weight of the accusation bore down on her, but she refused to let herself crumble. Halfway down the driveway, her bag slipped from her shoulder, spilling its contents onto the pavement. She hurried to pick everything up, but her fingers froze when she saw the small photograph lying face up on the ground. Before she could grab it, Brian's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, stepping closer. He bent down, picked up the photo and stared at it. His face paled, and his eyes widened in shock. "Where did you get this?" Brian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ashley hesitated, unsure why he looked so shaken. It's the only thing I have of my mother," she said softly. Brian's hands trembled as he held the photo. The image was unmistakable. Donna, his wife, smiling warmly as she cradled a baby in her arms. Ashley furrowed her brows, confused by his reaction. "Why, do you know her?" Brian didn't answer immediately. His mind raced as he stared at the photo, the same photo he had kept in his office for years, a relic of a life he thought had been lost forever. "I need to know everything," Brian said finally, his voice firm. "Where did this photo come from? Who gave it to you?" Ashley blinked, taken aback by the intensity in his tone. It's always been mine," My foster mother said it was left with me when I was a baby. Brian's breath caught. The implications of her words hit him like a freight train. You need to come back inside, Brian said, his voice unsteady. There's something I need to find out. Ashley followed Brian back into the mansion, her heart pounding with a mix of confusion and apprehension. The last place she wanted to be was inside this house after what had just happened. But something about Brian's reaction to the photograph made her curious. He didn't seem angry anymore. He seemed unsettled. Brian led her into his private study, a room she had only entered to clean. The walls were lined with shelves brimming with books, and the scent of leather and aged paper filled the air. He gestured for her to sit, but Ashley remained standing, clutching her bag tightly. Brian walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a picture frame. Without a word, he placed it in front of Ashley. She stared at the image, her breath catching in her throat. It was the same photograph. Her mother, Donna, holding a baby. Where did you get this? Ashley asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That's what I'm trying to figure out, Brian replied, his tone steady but laced with urgency. This photo, it's of my wife, Donna. She disappeared 25 years ago. Ashley blinked, her mind racing to comprehend his words. Your wife, but that's my mother. Or at least, that's what I've always been told. Brian leaned back in his chair, his expression conflicted. Tell me everything you know about her. Where did you grow up? Who raised you? Ashley hesitated. She didn't owe him anything, especially after what had just happened. But there was something in his eyes, a desperate need for answers, that mirrored her own longing to know the truth about her mother. I grew up in the foster system, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I was left at an orphanage when I was 3. The only thing they said was that my mother left me with this photograph and disappeared. No name, no explanation, just gone. Brian's jaw tightened, his mind racing through memories of Donna. She had been his everything, a woman with a gentle soul and an infectious laugh. The day she vanished had been the darkest of his life. For years, he had searched for her, exhausting every lead, but eventually, he was forced to accept the unthinkable. Donna was gone forever. Until now, Ashley's story didn't just stir old wounds, it reopened them completely. I don't understand, Brian said finally. Why would she leave you at an orphanage? And how could no one have found her all this time? Ashley shook her head. I've been asking myself that question my whole life. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the distant hum of the mansion's heating system. Finally, Brian stood, his posture firm. We need answers, he said, more to himself than to Ashley. I'm not sure how you're going to get them, Ashley replied cautiously. This is all I have, this photo and some vague memories that don't even make sense half the time. Brian's gaze softened as he looked at her. Despite the initial accusations and the awkward circumstances, he couldn't deny the possibility that Ashley might be connected to Donna. Let me help you, he said. I know people, investigators who can dig deeper. If there's even the slightest chance you're Donna's daughter, we have to find out. Ashley hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk out the door and never look back. But another part, the part that had spent countless nights staring at that photo, wanted answers just as much as Brian did. What about the necklace? She asked, her voice laced with bitterness. You were ready to believe I was a thief not even an hour ago. Brian's expression darkened, guilt flickering across his face. I owe you an apology for that. I let Norma's accusations cloud my judgment. But this is bigger than that. Please let me make it right. Ashley studied him for a long moment, her instincts warring with her desire for the truth. Finally, she nodded. All right, but this doesn't mean I trust you. That's fair, Brian said, but I promise you'll have my full support in finding the truth. The next few days passed in a blur. Brian wasted no time hiring a team of private investigators to look into Ashley's past and re-examine Donna's disappearance. Meanwhile, Ashley tried to keep her head down, avoiding Norma as much as possible. Norma, however, seemed more irritable than ever. Her sharp remarks and cold glares followed Ashley wherever she went. Something about the situation seemed to have rattled her, though Ashley couldn't put her finger on what it was. One evening, as Ashley was leaving the mansion, Norma cornered her near the front door. You think you're so clever, don't you? She hissed. Ashley frowned. What are you talking about? "You don't belong here," Norma snapped. "Mark my words, whatever game you're playing, it won't end well for you." Ashley didn't bother responding. She had bigger things to worry about than Norma's cryptic threats. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Ashley's mind raced with possibilities. If Brian was right, and Donna was her mother, why had she disappeared? And why would she leave her daughter behind? The photo sat on the nightstand, its edges worn from years of handling. Ashley picked it up and studied it, her fingers tracing the familiar face of the woman who had haunted her memories for so long. "Who were you?" she whispered. "And why did you leave me?" As sleep finally overtook her, Ashley dreamed of a woman's voice, soft and familiar, calling her name. Over the following days, Ashley felt as if her world had been turned upside down. Every time she walked through the mansion's doors, she couldn't shake the feeling that her entire life was shifting beneath her feet. Brian was relentless in his search for answers, meeting with the private investigators he had hired and poring over every piece of information they uncovered. Ashley, meanwhile, struggled to focus on her work. The photo she had carried her entire life, the one constant in her otherwise turbulent childhood, was now the center of a mystery she hadn't asked to be part of. One afternoon, as Ashley polished the dining room table, Brian entered the room, his expression unreadable. "We've found something," he said, his voice low but steady. Ashley straightened, her heart racing. "What is it?" Brian gestured for her to follow him. They walked to his study, where a folder lay open on his desk. The investigators had compiled a timeline based on Ashley's memories and records from the orphanage. "There's a discrepancy," Brian said, pointing to a document. "Donna was reported missing on November 12th, 25 years ago, but according to the orphanage records, you were left there on November 15th. That's only 3 days later." Ashley's eyes widened as she scanned the page. 3 days, she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian nodded. "Whoever left you there did it almost immediately after Donna disappeared. It's too much of a coincidence." Ashley sank into a chair, her mind spinning. "But why? Why would she leave me there? And who even took me in the first place?" "That's what we need to figure out," Brian said, his tone firm. "The investigators are looking into reports of suspicious activity in the area at the time. It's possible someone saw something." Ashley stared at the timeline, her thoughts racing. For as long as she could remember, she had believed that her mother had abandoned her. But now, the pieces didn't fit. If Donna had been taken against her will, then leaving Ashley at the orphanage might have been her way of protecting her. "Do you think she's still alive?" Ashley asked quietly. Brian hesitated, his gaze distant. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if there's even a chance, I need to find out, for both of us." The days turned into weeks, and the investigators continued to dig deeper. They uncovered reports of a suspicious vehicle seen near Brian and Donna's home on the night of her disappearance. But the trail went cold soon after. The details were frustratingly sparse, but they were enough to keep Brian's hope alive. Ashley found herself spending more time in Brian's study, poring over the documents with him. She didn't know why she cared so much. She barely knew the man, but something about his determination resonated with her. One evening, as they reviewed a new set of records, Brian looked up at her and said, "You remind me of her, you know." Ashley blinked, surprised. "Of Donna." He nodded. She had the same fire in her eyes, the same determination. "I see it every time you stand your ground." Ashley didn't know what to say. The idea of being compared to a woman she had spent her entire life wondering about felt both comforting and overwhelming as the investigation continued. Norma's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She seemed to be watching Ashley's every move, her sharp eyes narrowing whenever Ashley entered a room. One afternoon, Ashley caught Norma lingering near the study, her expression tense. "Can I help you with something?" Ashley asked, her tone cold. Norma flinched slightly before recovering. "Just making sure you're not overstepping your bounds," she replied curtly. Ashley rolled her eyes. "If you have something to say, just say it. I'm tired of the games." Norma's lips curled into a thin smile. "Be careful, Ashley," she said softly. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Ashley narrowed her eyes. "Neither do you," she shot back, stepping past Norma and slamming the study door behind her. Inside, Brian looked up from his desk, startled by the noise. "Is everything okay?" Ashley exhaled sharply. Norma, she's acting strange, stranger than usual. Brian frowned. I'll talk to her, he said. But for now, we need to stay focused. That night, as Ashley lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Norma's warning. There was something off about the woman, something Ashley couldn't quite put her finger on. But whatever it was, she knew she couldn't let it distract her from finding the truth. The following morning, Brian called Ashley into the study. He held a stack of papers in his hands, his expression grim. We've found something, he said. It's complicated. Ashley braced herself. What is it? Brian hesitated before handing her the papers. It's a police report from the night Donna disappeared. There was an eyewitness, a neighbor who saw her being forced into a car. But the strange thing is, the description of the woman doesn't match Donna completely. It's close, but not exact. Ashley stared at the report, her heart sinking. What does that mean? It means we might not be dealing with a straightforward case of abduction, Brian said. There's more to this than we realized. As Ashley processed the information, a thought struck her. Do you think Norma knows something? Brian's expression darkened. If she does, we'll find out soon enough. The tension in the mansion was palpable as Brian intensified the investigation into Donna's disappearance. Private investigators worked around the clock, gathering evidence, interviewing people connected to the case, and following every lead, no matter how small. Each day brought new fragments of information, but the full picture remained elusive. For Ashley, the days were a whirlwind of emotions. She oscillated between hope and frustration, desperate for answers yet dreading what they might reveal. The possibility that her mother had been taken against her will stirred a mixture of anger and sadness she hadn't expected. Norma, on the other hand, was a storm brewing just out of sight. Her presence loomed over the household, her sharp gaze following Ashley wherever she went. The older woman's usual air of authority now seemed tinged with paranoia. One morning, as Ashley arrived at the mansion, she found Norma in the foyer, speaking in hushed tones with another staff member. They stopped abruptly when they noticed her, and Norma's expression hardened. Late again? Norma said, her voice dripping with disdain. Ashley ignored her, walking past without a word. She had bigger things to worry about than Norma's petty comments, but the incident nagged at her as she went about her tasks. Something wasn't right. The way Norma had been acting lately, secretive, defensive, and increasingly hostile, set Ashley's instincts on edge. That afternoon, Brian called Ashley into the study. He looked exhausted but determined, the weight of the investigation evident in the lines on his face. We've made progress, he said, gesturing for her to sit. Ashley perched on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. What did you find? Brian slid a folder across the desk. The investigators uncovered a connection between Donna's disappearance and arrival of mine. Richard Calloway. He was involved in several business disputes with me around the time Donna vanished. Ashley frowned as she flipped through the documents. You think he had something to do with it? It's possible, Brian said, his voice grim. There's evidence suggesting he may have orchestrated her abduction as some sort of revenge, but there's still no explanation for why you were left at the orphanage. The revelation sent a chill down Ashley's spine. The idea that her mother's disappearance might have been part of a larger scheme was both terrifying and infuriating. What about Norma? Ashley asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Brian raised an eyebrow. What about her? Ashley hesitated. She's been acting strange. I don't know. It's like she's hiding something. Brian leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Norma's been with this household for decades. I've always trusted her, but if she knows something, I'll find out. Later that day, Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she cleaned the upstairs hallway, she caught a glimpse of Norma lingering at the end of the corridor, her face partially hidden behind a door frame. Ashley pretended not to notice, but her pulse quickened. She finished her work quickly and headed to the kitchen, hoping to avoid any further encounters. However, Norma wasn't done. That evening, as Ashley prepared to leave, Norma blocked her path near the front door. You're stirring up trouble, Norma said, her voice low and accusatory. Ashley crossed her arms, meeting Norma's glare head-on. I'm just trying to find out the truth. Sometimes the truth isn't worth finding, Norma snapped. You'd do well to remember that. Ashley's stomach churned with unease as Norma stepped aside, letting her pass. She didn't know what Norma was hiding, but it was clear the woman would do anything to keep her secrets buried. That night, Ashley replayed the conversation in her mind, her frustration growing. She was tired of feeling like an outsider in her own story. If Norma had answers, Ashley was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. The next day, Ashley confronted Brian again. "I think you should question Norma," she said bluntly. Brian sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've been considering it," he admitted, "but I need more than just a hunch. If I confront her without evidence, it could backfire." "Then we need evidence," Ashley said firmly. "She's hiding something. I can feel it." Brian studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll have the investigators look into her background. If there's anything there, we'll find it." As the investigation turned its focus toward Norma, the atmosphere in the mansion grew even more tense. Ashley couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and dread. A few days later, Brian approached Ashley with an update. "The investigators found something," he said, his tone grave. Ashley's breath caught. "What is it?" Brian hesitated before answering. Norma's name came up in some old police reports, incidents involving Donna's disappearance. The revelation sent a shockwave through Ashley. She was involved. "We don't know for sure yet," Brian said, "but it's enough to warrant a conversation. I'll speak to her tomorrow." That evening, Ashley lay awake in bed, her mind racing with possibilities. If Norma had been involved in Donna's disappearance, what did that mean for her? And what lengths would Norma go to in order to keep her secrets safe? The answers were just out of reach, but Ashley could feel them drawing closer with every passing day. The next morning, the mansion hummed with its usual activity, but the tension between Ashley and Norma felt like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Ashley tried to keep her focus on her work, yet her mind was clouded by the latest revelation. If Norma's name was tied to police reports from the time of Donna's disappearance, it meant she wasn't just a bystander. She might have been part of something much bigger. Brian called a meeting with Norma in his study, shutting the heavy wooden door behind them. Ashley stayed near the kitchen, her heart pounding as she tried to eavesdrop without drawing attention. From where she stood, she couldn't hear much, but she caught occasional snippets of raised voices. "What were you thinking?" Brian's voice boomed through the thick walls. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Norma shot back, her tone defensive. Moments later, the study door flew open and Norma stormed out, and her face flushed with anger. She didn't notice Ashley standing nearby and muttered something under her breath as she passed, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. Ashley hesitated before entering the study, unsure if Brian would want to talk. She found him pacing behind his desk, his brow furrowed in frustration. "Is everything okay?" she asked cautiously. Brian looked up, the weight of the conversation evident in his expression. "Norma's denying everything," he said, his voice tight. "But she knows more than she's letting on. I can feel it." Ashley crossed her arms. "Then what do we do now?" Brian sighed, sinking into his chair. "The investigators are digging deeper into her background. If there's any proof of her involvement, we'll find it." Ashley nodded, her resolve hardening. "Good. She's been trying to intimidate me ever since this started, but I'm not backing down." Brian's eyes softened as he looked at her. "You've been through a lot, Ashley. More than anyone should have to handle, I want you to know. I'll see this through. For you, for Donna, and for myself." For a brief moment, Ashley felt a flicker of hope, despite the chaos swirling around them. She wasn't alone in this fight. Later that day, Ashley was dusting the library shelves when she spotted a familiar photograph tucked between two books. It was one of the framed pictures of Donna, her warm smile captured forever in the glossy print. Ashley pulled the frame closer, studying Donna's face. There was something achingly familiar about her features. The curve of her lips, the spark in her eyes. It felt like staring at a reflection of her own memories, fragmented and incomplete. "Do you remember her?" Brian's voice startled Ashley, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway. She shook her head. "Not really. I have flashes sometimes. Images of someone singing to me, holding me, but I don't know if they're real or just something I made up to comfort myself." Brian stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the photo. "Donna loved music," he said softly. "She used to sing to me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. She had this way of making everything feel lighter, no matter how hard things got." Ashley swallowed the lump in her throat, unsure how to respond. The longing in Brian's voice mirrored the ache she had carried her whole life. "What was she like?" Ashley asked hesitantly. Brian's lips curved into a faint smile. "She was kind, strong-willed but gentle. She had this ability to see the good in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it." Ashley stared at the photograph again, her chest tightening. "Do you think she ever thought about me?" "After she left," Brian hesitated before answering. "If Donna knew you were out there, she would have moved heaven and earth to find you. I have no doubt about that." Ashley nodded, but her doubts lingered. If Donna had loved her so much, why had she left? And why hadn't she come back? As the days passed, the investigation began uncovering more pieces of the puzzle. The private investigators found records of large cash withdrawals made from Brian's accounts around the time of Donna's disappearance, money that seemed to vanish without a trace. "It doesn't make sense," Brian said during one of their late-night discussions. "Donna didn't have access to these accounts, and I certainly didn't authorize those withdrawals." Ashley frowned, her mind racing. Could someone else have used the money to cover their tracks? Brian nodded slowly. "It's possible. If Calloway was involved, he might have forced someone on the inside to help him." Ashley thought back to Norma's cryptic warnings and the way she had been acting since the photo was discovered. "Do you think Norma could have been that person?" Brian's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but if she was, it would explain a lot." The investigation also unearthed a witness statement from a former employee of Brian's who claimed to have seen a heated argument between Norma and a man matching Calloway's description shortly before Donna's disappearance. "It's not definitive proof," Brian said, "but it's enough to confront her again." Ashley felt a surge of anticipation. They were finally getting closer to the truth, but she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. That evening, as she prepared to leave the mansion, Ashley caught Norma staring at her from across the room. There was something different in her eyes this time. Not anger, but fear. Ashley met her gaze, refusing to look away. For the first time, she felt like she had the upper hand, and she wasn't about to let Norma intimidate her any longer. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was electric with tension. Brian had summoned Norma to his study once again, but this time he wasn't going to let her evade his questions. Ashley hovered nearby, her heart pounding as she tried to focus on cleaning the foyer. From behind the heavy study door, muffled voices carried into the hall. Brian's tone was sharp, filled with frustration, while Norma's replies came in bursts of defensiveness. "I've been loyal to this family for decades," Norma's voice rang out, loud enough for Ashley to hear clearly. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile?" "I'm not accusing you, Norma," Brian shot back, his voice cold. "But I need answers, and I'm not leaving this room until I get them." Ashley froze in place, clutching a feather duster in her hands. She strained to hear more, but the voices grew quieter as the conversation continued. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the study door opened abruptly. Norma stormed out, her face pale and her hands trembling. She didn't look at Ashley as she passed, muttering something under her breath. Brian stepped into the hallway moments later, his expression grim. "Ashley," he said, motioning for her to follow him into the study. She hesitated before entering. Unsure if she was ready for what he might say, Brian closed the door behind her and leaned against his desk, rubbing his temples. "Norma knows more than she's letting on," he said finally. She admitted to having contact with Richard Calloway before Donna disappeared, but she claims she didn't know anything about his plans. Ashley frowned, crossing her arms. "Do you believe her?" Brian shook his head. "Not entirely, but she did let something slip. She mentioned a large payment she received around that time. She insists it was unrelated, but I don't buy it." Ashley's stomach churned. "So she was working with him." "It's possible," Brian admitted. "But without concrete proof, I can't do much. The investigators are following up on her financial records to see if we can trace the money." Ashley sank into a chair, her mind racing. Why would she still be here after all this time, if she was involved? Wouldn't she have left? Brian sighed. Guilt, maybe. Or she thought no one would ever connect the dots. The conversation weighed heavily on Ashley as she returned to her duties. She couldn't stop thinking about Norma's pale face and trembling hands, signs of a woman whose secrets were dangerously close to unraveling. That afternoon, Ashley was cleaning the guest bedroom when she heard muffled voices coming from the hallway. Curious, She stepped closer to the door and peered out. Norma was speaking to one of the maids, her tone urgent and low. "You need to be careful," Norma was saying. "If they come asking questions, you don't know anything." "Understand," the maid nodded quickly, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes, ma'am. I won't say a word." Ashley's pulse quickened. She waited until Norma disappeared down the hallway before approaching the maid. "What was that about?" Ashley asked, trying to sound casual. The maid jumped, her face flushing. "Nothing, just work stuff." Ashley raised an eyebrow. "It didn't sound like nothing." The maid hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I can't talk about it," she whispered. "Please don't drag me into this." Ashley wanted to press further, but she could see the fear in the woman's eyes. Instead, she nodded and stepped back, filing the interaction away in her mind. That evening, Ashley decided to confront Norma herself. She found the older woman in the kitchen, sorting through a stack of paperwork with a scowl on her face. "We need to talk," Ashley said, her voice firm. Norma looked up, her expression icy. "I don't have time for this." "Make time," Ashley shot back, stepping closer. "I know you're hiding something, and if you think you can intimidate me into staying quiet, you're wrong." Norma's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Ashley countered. "You've been acting guilty since the moment this investigation started. If you're not involved, why are you so afraid?" Norma's hands trembled as she set down the papers. For a moment, Ashley thought she might finally confess, but instead, Norma straightened her shoulders and fixed Ashley with a steely glare. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," Norma said softly. "Some truths are better left buried." With that, she brushed past Ashley and left the room, leaving her more determined than ever to uncover the full story. The next day, Brian called Ashley into the study again. He held a stack of documents in his hands, his expression grave. "The investigators traced the payment Norma received," he said. "It was transferred from an offshore account linked to Calloway's business." Ashley's breath caught. "So she was working with him." "It looks that way," Brian said, his jaw tightening. "But the question is, how much did she know, and why did she stay here all these years?" As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of a major breakthrough. That night, as she lay in bed, Ashley replayed the day's events in her mind. Norma's cryptic warnings and defensive behavior made more sense now, but they also raised new questions. If Norma had been complicit in Donna's disappearance, what else was she hiding? And how far would she go to keep her secrets safe? The answers felt tantalizingly close, but Ashley knew there was still more to uncover. A breakthrough finally came late one evening, when one of the investigators called Brian with an urgent update. Ashley was in the kitchen, finishing up a late-night cup of tea, when Brian burst in, his face pale, but his eyes bright with excitement. "They found her," he said, his voice trembling. Ashley froze, the mug halfway to her lips. "Found who?" "Donna," Brian said. "She's alive, she's in Texas." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ashley's heart raced as 1,000 emotions surged through her. Relief, disbelief, and a cautious hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "When do we leave?" she asked, setting her mug down with a firm resolve. Brian didn't hesitate. "Tomorrow, the next morning." They boarded a flight to a small town in Texas. The journey was filled with an awkward silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Brian stared out the window, his fingers tapping nervously against the armrest, while Ashley clutched the photo of her mother tightly, her mind racing with possibilities. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the dusty streets. The private investigator met them outside a modest house on the edge of town. "She's inside," he said, gesturing toward the front door. Brian took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he stepped forward. Ashley followed, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The door creaked open to reveal a woman in her late 40s, her face lined with age and weariness, but unmistakably familiar. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes, so much like Ashley's, widened in shock as she saw them standing there. "Donna," Brian whispered, his voice cracking. The woman's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Brian. Before either of them could say more, Ashley stepped forward, clutching the photo in her trembling hands. "Is it you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Donna's gaze shifted to Ashley, and the recognition was immediate. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "My baby, Ashley." The next moments were a blur of emotion as Donna embraced them both, her sobs muffled against Brian's shoulder. Ashley stood frozen for a moment before finally allowing herself to lean into the hug, the warmth of her mother's arms both foreign and familiar. Inside the house, they sat at a small kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken questions. Donna poured cups of tea with trembling hands, her gaze flicking between Brian and Ashley as if afraid they might disappear. "I thought I'd never see either of you again," Donna said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "I didn't want to leave, but I had no choice." "What happened?" Brian asked gently. "Why did you disappear?" Donna took a shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. "It was Richard Calloway. He wanted revenge on you, Brian. He threatened to hurt Ashley if I didn't go with him. I thought if I left, she'd be safe." Ashley's chest tightened. "But why leave me at the orphanage? Why not come back for me?" Donna's voice broke as she answered. "I wanted to. Every day. I wanted to. But Calloway kept me under his control for years. By the time I escaped, I didn't know where to start looking for you. I thought you'd be better off without me." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Ashley didn't know what to feel. Anger at being left behind, sorrow for what her mother had endured, or relief that she was finally here. Brian reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over Donna's. "It wasn't your fault," he said softly. "What matters now is that we're together again." Donna nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I never stopped thinking about either of you. Not for a single day." As the night wore on, Donna shared more details of her harrowing experience. How Calloway had manipulated her, the years she spent trying to escape, and the guilt that had haunted her ever since. "I was so scared he'd find Ashley," Donna said, her voice trembling. "I thought leaving her at the orphanage was the only way to keep her safe." Ashley listened in silence, her emotions swirling. She had spent her whole life wondering why her mother had abandoned her, and now that she had the answer, it wasn't as simple as she had imagined. When the conversation finally lulled, Brian looked at Donna with a determined expression. "We'll make this right," he said. "Calloway will pay for what he did." Donna's eyes widened in fear. "Brian, no, he's dangerous. I don't want you getting hurt because of me." Brian's jaw tightened. "He's already taken too much from us. It's time he faced the consequences." Ashley met her mother's gaze, her voice firm. "We're not running anymore." The determination in their eyes left no room for argument. For the first time in years, Donna allowed herself to hope that they might finally find peace and justice. That night, as Ashley lay in the guest room of Donna's small house, she stared at the photo on the nightstand. For the first time, it didn't feel like a relic of a life she couldn't reach. It felt like the beginning of something new. The next morning, the small house in Texas buzzed with an undercurrent of quiet energy. Donna had woken early to prepare breakfast, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filling the air. Ashley sat at the kitchen table, watching her mother move around the room. It felt surreal, like a dream she was afraid to wake from. Brian joined them soon after, his presence grounding the moment. He had spent most of the night poring over the investigators' reports and planning their next steps. But now, he looked at Donna with a softness Ashley hadn't seen before. "It's strange, isn't it?" Donna said, setting a plate in front of Ashley. "Sitting here like this, as if no time has passed." Ashley nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "It's strange, but it's good," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Donna smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I used to dream about this, about having you here, both of you. I just never thought it would actually happen." Brian reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "We're here now. That's what matters." For a while, they ate in comfortable silence, the weight of the past momentarily giving way to the warmth of shared company. But as the meal ended, the reality of their situation crept back in. "What do we do next?" Ashley asked, breaking the silence. Brian exchanged a glance with Donna before answering. "The investigators are still gathering evidence. If Calloway is as involved as we think, we need to be careful. He's not the kind of man who plays fair. Donna's expression darkened. He'll do whatever it takes to protect himself. If he finds out you're looking into this. He won't, Brian interrupted firmly. We'll handle this quietly. I won't let him hurt anyone again. Ashley listened, her chest tightening. She had spent her entire life feeling powerless. But now, with her mother and Brian by her side, she felt a spark of something unfamiliar. Strength. Whatever happens, we face it together, Ashley said, her voice steady. Donna's gaze softened as she looked at her daughter. You've grown into such a strong woman, she said, her voice tinged with pride. I wish I could have been there to see it. Ashley hesitated, her emotions warring within her. I used to be angry, she admitted. For a long time I thought you left because you didn't want me. But now, I get it. You did what you thought you had to do. Donna's tears spilled over as she reached for Ashley's hand. I never stopped loving you, she whispered. Not for a single moment. The words, simple yet powerful, broke through the wall Ashley had built around her heart. She squeezed her mother's hand tightly, allowing herself to believe them. Later that day, Brian received another call from the investigators. He stepped outside to take it, leaving Ashley and Donna alone in the kitchen. Donna hesitated before speaking. There's something you should know, she said, her tone tentative. Ashley looked up, curiosity flickering in her eyes. What is it? Calloway didn't just want to hurt Brian, Donna began, her voice trembling. He wanted control over everything, Brian's business, his reputation, and me. When he took me, he said he'd ruin Brian's life piece by piece. Ashley's fists clenched. And you were part of his plan, Donna nodded. I thought if I stayed away he'd lose interest, but he didn't. Even after I escaped, I was too scared to come back. I didn't want to put you or Brian in danger. Ashley's chest tightened with anger, not at her mother, but at the man who had caused so much pain. He doesn't get to win, she said firmly. Not anymore. Brian returned a few minutes later, his expression serious. We have a lead, he said, his tone brisk. Calloway owns a property in Dallas, a warehouse that's been flagged for suspicious activity. The investigators think it might be connected to everything. Donna's face paled. You're not going there, are you? I have to, Brian said. If we can tie him to this, we can take him down. Ashley stood, her resolve unwavering. I'm coming with you. Brian hesitated, but the determination in her eyes left no room for argument. All right, he said, but we have to be careful. This isn't just about finding evidence. It's about making sure no one gets hurt. That evening, as they prepared for the trip to Dallas, Donna pulled Ashley aside. Promise me you'll be careful, she said, her voice trembling. I will, Ashley assured her. But I can't sit back and do nothing, not anymore. Donna nodded, though worry clouded her eyes. You're so much like your father, she said softly. Ashley froze. My father? Donna hesitated, then smiled faintly. Brian, he doesn't know for sure, but I always believed you were his. It's why I left you with that photo. I wanted you to find your way back to him. Somehow, the revelation hit Ashley like a tidal wave. She had always wondered about her father, and now, the possibility that it might be Brian added a new layer to her emotions. As they set out for Dallas the next morning, Ashley's mind raced with questions. But one thing was clear. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead. With her family by her side, back at the mansion in New York, the air was heavy with unease. While Ashley and Brian pursued the lead in Texas, Norma remained behind, growing increasingly paranoid as the walls of her carefully guarded secrets began to close in. She paced the long hallways of the grand estate, her thoughts racing. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the distant hum of the vacuum, set her nerves on edge. She had worked in this house for decades, rising through the ranks to become the trusted head housekeeper. But now, with investigators circling and Ashley's persistence, Norma felt her grip on the situation slipping. In a desperate attempt to protect herself, Norma decided to take matters into her own hands. Late one evening, she ventured into Brian's study, her heart pounding as she rifled through his desk drawers. She needed to know how much they had uncovered, and how much danger she was in. Her hands trembled as she opened a file folder. revealing a series of documents marked with Calloway's name. Skimming the pages, she saw references to offshore accounts and a payment that could tie her directly to Donna's disappearance. "No," she whispered, her voice shaky. "This can't come out. It can't." A voice behind her broke the tense silence. "What are you doing, Norma?" Norma whirled around to see one of the junior maids standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. "I was just organizing the files," Norma said quickly, trying to sound composed. The maid hesitated, clearly unconvinced. "I don't think you're supposed to be in here." Norma's lips thinned as she stepped closer. "Listen to me," she said, her tone low and threatening. "You didn't see anything. If anyone asks, you'll tell them I was checking the inventory records." "Understood." The maid nodded nervously, backing away. Norma watched her retreat, her stomach churning. She knew she was losing control, and the pressure was beginning to crack her once calm facade. The next morning, Norma's paranoia only deepened when she overheard a phone conversation between one of the investigators and Brian's assistant. Though she couldn't catch every word, the snippets she did hear, "finalized soon," "direct link to Calloway," and "implicate her," were enough to send her into a panic. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. Norma decided to confront the maid who had seen her in the study. She found the young woman in the laundry room, folding linens. "We need to talk," Norma said, her tone clipped. The maid froze, her hands clutching a pillowcase. "I already told you, I won't say anything." "That's not good enough," Norma snapped. "I need to know you're loyal to me because if you're not..." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging in the air. The maid swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "I'm loyal, I promise." Satisfied for the moment, Norma left the laundry room, but the encounter did little to calm her nerves. She couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Later that day, one of the investigators arrived at the mansion to collect additional documents from Brian's office. Norma watched him from the shadows of the hallway, her breath hitching as he carried a briefcase filled with files out the front door. The weight of her involvement in Donna's disappearance pressed down on her like a physical burden. She had told herself for years that she had no choice, that her actions were necessary to protect herself. But now, faced with the possibility of exposure, Norma began to question whether the cost of her silence had been worth it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Norma found herself alone in the grand dining room. The flickering light from the chandelier cast long shadows across the walls, mirroring the darkness in her thoughts. She poured herself a glass of wine, her hands shaking as she brought it to her lips. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to remember the events of that fateful night. Calloway had approached her with an offer she couldn't refuse. He needed someone on the inside, someone who could provide access to Donna and ensure that his plan went smoothly. In return, he promised her financial security and protection from any fallout. At the time, Norma had justified her decision as a matter of survival. But now, as the truth threatened to come to light, she realized how deeply she had betrayed the people who had trusted her. Norma's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see one of the junior maids standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Miss Norma," the maid said softly, "I think you should know. The investigators are planning to question the staff tomorrow. They're looking for anyone who might have information about Mrs. Wallace's disappearance." Norma's stomach twisted, the wine glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. The maid flinched, backing away as Norma's face turned pale. "Get out," Norma said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. As the maid hurried away, Norma sank into a chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay one step ahead, but now she felt like a pawn in a game she could no longer control. The next morning, Norma woke early, determined to find a way out. She began packing her belongings, her movements frantic as she shoved clothes and personal items into a suitcase. But as she zipped the bag closed, a knock at the door stopped her in her tracks. "Norma," a voice called. It was one of the investigators. "We need to talk." Norma's heart raced as she opened the door, her mind scrambling for an excuse. But the look on the investigator's face told her that her time had run out. The flight back to New York was tense. Ashley sat by the window, staring at the clouds as they drifted below. Her mind replayed Donna's words from the night before. The revelation about her father gnawing at her thoughts. Could Brian really be her father? And if so, why hadn't anyone told him, or her, before now, beside her? Brian was quiet, lost in his own thoughts. He had spent the past several days coming to terms with finding Donna alive and unraveling the mystery surrounding her disappearance. But Donna's implication about Ashley's parentage had stirred something deeper, a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider until now. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was charged with unease. Brian's return signaled progress in the investigation, and the staff moved cautiously, their whispers filling the hallways. Ashley, however, was focused on something more personal. That evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Ashley approached Brian in his study. He was sitting at his desk, flipping through reports from the investigators, but he looked up when she entered. "Do you have a minute?" Ashley asked hesitantly. "Of course," Brian said, gesturing for her to sit. Ashley hesitated before speaking. "When we were in Texas, Donna, she said something. About you. About me." Brian's brow furrowed, his expression shifting to one of concern. "What did she say?" Ashley took a deep breath. "She said you might be my father." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Brian leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable as he processed what she had just said. "Did she say that definitively?" he asked after a long pause. "She said she believed it," Ashley replied, "but she wasn't sure." Brian exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to say. It's possible, but I never knew. Donna never told me she was pregnant before she disappeared." Ashley nodded, her emotions swirling. "I think we need to find out for sure. I've spent my whole life not knowing who my parents were, and now that I've found both of you, I need the truth." Brian studied her for a moment before nodding. "You're right. We need to know." The next morning, Brian arranged for a DNA test. The process was quick and clinical, but for Ashley, it felt monumental. As she left the clinic, her mind raced with questions. What if Brian wasn't her father? Would it change the way he looked at her, or the way she looked at him? Back at the mansion, Norma's actions were growing increasingly erratic. The investigators had begun questioning the staff, and though she had managed to deflect their inquiries so far, she knew her time was running out. One afternoon, Ashley walked into the kitchen to find Norma arguing with one of the maids. "You don't know what you're talking about," Norma snapped, her voice low and threatening. "I'm just saying what I heard," the maid replied, her voice trembling. "They're going to find out everything eventually." Ashley cleared her throat, interrupting the tense exchange. "Everything okay in here?" Norma spun around, her eyes narrowing. "This doesn't concern you," she said sharply. "Doesn't it?" Ashley shot back, stepping closer. "If you know something about my mother, or about Calloway, you need to come clean. Hiding it won't help you anymore." Norma's face turned pale, but she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, before brushing past Ashley and storming out of the room. Ashley turned to the maid, who looked visibly shaken. "What was that about?" The maid hesitated, glancing at the doorway as if afraid Norma might return. "She's scared," the maid said quietly. "She knows the investigators are closing in." Ashley's jaw tightened. "Good. It's about time." That evening, Brian joined Ashley in the living room, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "The results will be ready tomorrow," he said, sitting beside her. Ashley nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Do you think it'll change anything?" Brian looked at her, his gaze steady. "No, whether I'm your father or not, you're still family. That doesn't change." His words brought a lump to Ashley's throat, but she managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said softly. The next morning, the results arrived. Brian called Ashley into the study, where the envelope lay unopened on his desk. "Do you want to open it?" he asked, sliding it toward her. Ashley hesitated, her hands trembling as she picked up the envelope. She tore it open slowly, her heart pounding as she unfolded the paper inside. Her eyes scanned the page, and when she reached the conclusion, her breath caught. "It's positive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're my father." Brian's face softened, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I had a feeling," he said, his voice filled with quiet emotion. Ashley looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. I spent my whole life wondering who I was, and now I finally know. Brian stood and pulled her into a tight embrace. You've always known who you are, Ashley. You're strong, resilient, and brave. And now, you're home. The moment was bittersweet, filled with both relief and the weight of all they had lost. But for the first time, Ashley felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. The revelation of Ashley's paternity cast a ripple through the mansion. For Brian, it was the confirmation of something he had begun to suspect, a connection he felt in his heart but had never dared to articulate. For Ashley, it was the closure she had longed for, though it brought its own set of complications. As the sun streamed through the study windows, Ashley sat alone, staring at the DNA test results. The words on the page were definitive, but the emotions they stirred were anything but simple. She had a father, a real, living father, but their relationship was still uncharted territory. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Donna entered hesitantly, her eyes warm but cautious. "I heard the news," Donna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How are you feeling?" Ashley shrugged, folding the paper and tucking it into her pocket. "I don't know, it's a lot to process." Donna nodded, sitting beside her. "I can't imagine what you're going through, but I'm glad you know the truth now. You deserve that." Ashley turned to her, her expression conflicted. "Why didn't you tell him all those years? Why didn't you say anything?" Donna's eyes filled with regret. "I wanted to," she admitted. "But by the time I realized I was pregnant, everything with Calloway had already spiraled out of control, I thought. I thought keeping quiet was the best way to protect you." Ashley's jaw tightened. "But it wasn't. I grew up without either of you because of it." Donna reached for her hand, her voice trembling. "I know I made mistakes, Ashley, and I can't change the past, but I want to make it right. I want to be here for you, for both of you." Ashley looked down at their joined hands, her anger softening. "I want that too," she said quietly. Later that day, Ashley found Brian in the garden, pruning a row of rose bushes. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Hey," she said, her voice tentative. "Hey," Brian replied, setting the shears aside. They stood in silence for a moment before Ashley spoke. "I want to say thank you for everything, for not giving up on finding the truth." Brian's gaze softened. "I owed you that much, and so much more." Ashley hesitated before asking the question that had been weighing on her. "Do you think things will ever feel normal between us?" Brian smiled faintly. "I don't know, but normal is overrated, don't you think?" Ashley laughed despite herself, the tension easing slightly. "Yeah, maybe you're right." As the days passed, the mansion became a hive of activity. The investigators were closing in on Calloway, and the weight of the looming confrontation hung over everyone. Norma, however, seemed to be unraveling. She avoided Brian and Ashley whenever possible, her once confident demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that was impossible to ignore. One evening, Ashley caught her pacing near the kitchen, muttering under her breath. "Norma!" Ashley called out, making the older woman jump. "What's going on with you?" "Nothing," Norma snapped, straightening her posture. "I don't know what you're implying." Ashley stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "You've been acting strange ever since this investigation started. If you're hiding something, now's the time to come clean." Norma's eyes darted nervously, but she said nothing. "Fine," Ashley said, her tone firm. "But if I were you, I'd start thinking about how to fix this, because once they find the proof they need, there won't be any more chances." Norma's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving Ashley with a growing sense of unease. That night, Ashley sat in her room. The DNA results spread out on the bed beside her. She felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, sadness, and hope, all tangled together in a way she couldn't untangle. She pulled out the photograph of her mother, the one she had carried with her since childhood. It felt different now, less like a relic of the past and more like a bridge to the future. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Brian stepped inside, his expression warm but serious. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "I'm okay," Ashley replied, though her voice wavered slightly. Brian sat beside her, his gaze falling on the photograph in her hands. "You know, I used to stare at that picture for hours after Donna disappeared, he said softly. It was the only thing that made me feel like she was still here. Ashley looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I used to do the same thing. It's funny, isn't it? We were both holding on to the same thing, in different ways. Brian nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. We've lost a lot of time. Ashley, but I'm here now, and I want to make up for it. Ashley swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. I want that too. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ashley allowed herself to hope that things might finally be okay. But deep down, she knew the fight wasn't over yet. Calloway was still out there, and Norma's secrets were still lurking in the shadows. The road ahead was uncertain, but Ashley was ready to face it. With her family by her side, the morning air at the mansion was unusually still, as if the house itself sensed that something monumental was about to happen. Ashley paced nervously in the foyer while Brian sat in the study, waiting for the investigators to arrive. Their latest findings had promised to uncover the missing pieces of Donna's disappearance, and potentially expose Norma's involvement once and for all. Norma, however, was nowhere to be found. Her usual domineering presence had been replaced by an eerie silence, leaving the staff on edge. Ashley couldn't help but wonder if she had finally cracked under the pressure. When the lead investigator, Mr. Carter, arrived, his expression was serious. We've compiled enough evidence to confront Norma directly, he said. Her financial records show a clear connection to Calloway. Payments were made to her account shortly before and after Donna's disappearance. It's undeniable. Brian's jaw tightened. And Calloway, we've tracked his movements to the property in Dallas, Carter replied. But we need a confession from Norma to tie everything together. She's the missing link. Ashley's stomach churned. A confession. After all the lies and manipulation, could Norma finally tell the truth? Moments later, the investigators found Norma in her quarters, frantically packing a suitcase. Her face paled as they entered the room, followed closely by Brian and Ashley. Leaving so soon? Brian asked coldly, his arms crossed. Norma froze, her hands trembling as she clutched a pile of clothes. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. You've been lying to us this entire time, Ashley said, her voice sharp. We know about the payments. We know about Calloway. It's over, Norma. Norma's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. Finally, she sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. I didn't have a choice, she whispered. Start talking, Brian demanded, his voice low and menacing. Norma looked up, tears streaming down her face. Calloway approached me years ago. He wanted revenge on you, Brian. He said if I helped him, he'd make sure I was taken care of. I didn't know what he was planning. Not at first. Not at first, Ashley echoed, her anger bubbling to the surface. You knew enough to take his money. Norma flinched, her voice trembling as she continued. I thought it was just business, something petty between rivals. But then he told me about Donna. He said he wanted to take her away, to hurt you in the worst way possible. Brian's fists clenched at his sides, his voice barely controlled. And you went along with it. I didn't think he'd go through with it, Norma cried. I thought he was bluffing, but when he took her, I was in too deep. He threatened me, said he'd ruin me if I didn't keep quiet. And the payments, Mr. Carter pressed. They were hush money, Norma admitted, her voice breaking. To make sure I stayed loyal. I didn't know what else to do. Ashley's voice shook with fury. You let my mother suffer for years. You let me grow up without her, without my family, just so you could protect yourself. I'm sorry, Norma whispered, her face crumpling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Brian stepped forward, his tone icy. Sorry doesn't cut it, Norma, not after everything you've done. Norma broke down, her sobs filling the room as she confessed to everything. The meetings with Calloway, the payments, and her role in keeping Donna's disappearance a secret. It was all the investigators needed. They placed Norma under arrest, leading her out of the room as she wept. Ashley and Brian watched in silence, their emotions too raw to process. Later that evening, Ashley sat with Donna in the living room, recounting the day's events. Donna listened quietly, her expression a mixture of sadness and relief. I always suspected Norma knew more than she let on, Donna said softly. But hearing it confirmed, It's harder than I thought it would be. Ashley nodded, her gaze distant. She had so many chances to do the right thing, and she never did. I don't think I'll ever understand how someone could live with themselves after that. Brian joined them moments later, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The investigators are preparing to confront Calloway, he said. With Norma's confession, we have enough to take him down. Donna's eyes widened with fear. You're not going to Dallas, are you? I have to, Brian said firmly. This ends now. Ashley stood, her resolve unwavering. I'm coming with you. No, Donna said sharply, her voice trembling. It's too dangerous. I can't sit here and do nothing, Ashley argued. Not after everything we've been through. I need to see this through. Brian placed a reassuring hand on Donna's shoulder. We'll be careful, he promised. But Calloway needs to answer for what he's done. For all of it. The determination in their eyes left no room for debate, as the family prepared for the final confrontation. Ashley felt a sense of closure beginning to take shape. They had exposed Norma's betrayal and uncovered the truth about Donna's disappearance. Now, only one thing remained: to bring Calloway to justice and ensure he could never hurt anyone again. The trip to Dallas was a mixture of tension and anticipation. Ashley sat silently in the back seat, her hands gripping the photograph of her mother, while Brian stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched with determination. The investigators followed closely in another vehicle, prepared for the confrontation that could finally bring years of suffering to an end. As the Dallas skyline loomed closer, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on Ashley's chest. She glanced at Brian, who hadn't spoken much since they left the mansion. His silence wasn't unfamiliar. It was a sign of focus, of his resolve to see justice served. You sure we're ready for this? Ashley finally asked. Breaking the silence, Brian glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. We have to be. This is the only way to make sure he never hurts anyone again. The warehouse stood on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling structure surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted fences. Its unassuming exterior betrayed nothing of the secrets it held. The investigators pulled ahead, parking near the entrance as they signaled for Brian and Ashley to follow. Remember, Mr. Carter said as they gathered by the car, his voice calm but firm. We have the evidence we need. Your presence here is about closure, not risk. Let us handle Calloway. Ashley nodded, though her heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't just about closure. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself that had been stolen years ago. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. Calloway was sitting at a desk in the center of the cavernous space, his back turned to them. The sound of their footsteps echoed as they approached, drawing his attention. He turned slowly, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to wary curiosity, as he saw Brian and Ashley flanked by investigators. Well, Calloway drawled, leaning back in his chair. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? Brian Wallace. It's been years. Brian stepped forward, his voice steady. We're here for answers, Calloway, and justice. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. Justice? That's a bold word coming from you. I seem to recall you weren't always so squeaky clean yourself. This isn't about me, Brian said, his tone cold. This is about what you did to Donna, and to Ashley. Calloway's gaze flicked to Ashley, his smirk widening. Ah, the daughter. You've grown up, haven't you? I see you've inherited your father's fire. Ashley took a step forward, her voice sharp. Don't talk about me like you know me. You ruined my family, and now you're going to pay for it. Calloway stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Big words for someone so young? Tell me, do you even know the whole story? Or are you just repeating what Daddy told you? Ashley's fists clenched, but Brian placed a calming hand on her shoulder. We know everything, Brian said. Norma confessed. We have the records, the payments, and now the truth. It's over, Calloway. Calloway's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, folding his arms across his chest. You think a few papers and the word of a desperate housekeeper can bring me down. You're more naive than I thought. Mr. Carter stepped forward, holding a folder filled with evidence. It's more than enough, he said. Your offshore accounts, the payments to Norma, and the witness statements all tie you to Donna's disappearance. We've already contacted the authorities. For the first time, Calloway's confidence wavered. He glanced around the room, his mind racing as he calculated his next move. "You can't prove anything," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "It's all circumstantial." Ashley's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "We don't need to prove anything to you. You're done." Calloway lunged for the desk, his hand reaching for something beneath the papers. Before he could grab it, 2 investigators tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back as he struggled and shouted obscenities. Ashley watched, her chest heaving with adrenaline. The sight of Calloway subdued and powerless was both cathartic and surreal. After years of pain and unanswered questions, the man who had torn her family apart was finally facing justice. Brian stepped forward, looking down at Calloway with disdain. "This could have ended differently," he said quietly. "But you made your choice." Calloway glared up at him, his face twisted with rage. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You'll regret this, Wallace, I promise you." Brian didn't flinch. "The only thing I regret is not stopping you sooner." As the authorities arrived to take Calloway into custody, Ashley stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting her like a wave. She leaned against the car, her legs trembling as the weight of the moment settled over her. Brian joined her, his expression weary but relieved. "You okay?" he asked gently. Ashley nodded, though her voice shook as she replied, "It's finally over." Brian placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Not just yet, but we're close." Back at the mansion, Donna was waiting anxiously by the window when she saw the car pull into the driveway. She rushed outside, her heart pounding. Ashley stepped out first, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Donna wrapped her in a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "I was so scared," Donna whispered. "Donna, it's done," Ashley said softly. "He can't hurt us anymore." Brian approached them, his expression softening as he looked at Donna. "He's in custody. The investigators will take it from here." Donna let out a shaky breath, her relief palpable. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything," as the family stepped inside. The mansion seemed warmer, lighter, filled with a sense of hope they hadn't felt in years. They had faced the past, exposed the lies, and reclaimed their future. But as they sat together that evening, laughing and sharing stories, they knew one thing for certain. Their journey wasn't just about justice. It was about healing, and they were finally on the path to finding peace. The following days at the mansion were unlike any Ashley had ever experienced. For the first time in years, the house felt alive, not with the usual bustling of staff and duties, but with a newfound sense of purpose. The weight that had hung over the family for decades had begun to lift. Though the scars it left behind were still fresh, Ashley woke early one morning, stepping onto the balcony that overlooked the estate's sprawling gardens. The crisp morning air filled her lungs as she gazed at the horizon, the sun rising slowly and casting a golden glow over the dew-kissed grass. It felt symbolic, a new beginning, the promise of a brighter future. Brian joined her moments later, a mug of coffee in his hand. He leaned against the railing, his expression contemplative. "You've been quiet since we got back," he said, breaking the silence. Ashley nodded, her gaze fixed on the gardens below. "Just trying to process everything. It's a lot." Brian took a sip of his coffee, his voice gentle. "It is, but you've handled it better than anyone I know." Ashley smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed the storm of emotions she was still grappling with. "I don't feel like I've handled it. Half the time, I don't even know what to feel." Brian reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay not to have all the answers right now. What matters is that we're moving forward. Together." Ashley looked at him, her smile softening. "Together," she echoed. Later that morning, the family gathered in the living room. Donna sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Ashley and Brian joined her. "We need to talk about what's next," Brian said, his tone steady. "Calloway is in custody, and the investigators have everything they need to ensure he's held accountable. But now, it's about us, about rebuilding what we've lost." Donna nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I've spent so many years hiding, so many years afraid. I don't want to live like that anymore." Ashley leaned forward, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Neither do I. But rebuilding isn't just about moving on. It's about making sure we don't let the past define us." Brian smiled, pride evident in his expression. "You're right, and that starts with honesty, with each other and with ourselves." Donna hesitated before speaking. "There's something I've been thinking about since we got back. I want to tell my story, not just to you, but to the world. I want people to know what happened, so it doesn't happen to anyone else." Ashley and Brian exchanged a glance. Donna's resolve was clear, and though the idea of revisiting the trauma she had endured was daunting, they both understood her need to take control of her narrative. "We'll support you," Brian said firmly. "Whatever you need, we're here." Over the next few weeks, Donna worked closely with a journalist, recounting her experiences in painstaking detail. It was a cathartic process, though not without its challenges. There were days when the memories became too much, and Donna would retreat to her room, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But with Ashley and Brian by her side, she found the strength to keep going. Meanwhile, Ashley began to carve out her own path. With Brian's encouragement, she enrolled in a design program she had dreamed of attending for years, but had never thought possible. "You have a gift, Ashley," Brian told her as they filled out the application together. "It's time the world sees it." The acceptance letter arrived on a sunny afternoon, and Ashley couldn't contain her excitement. She ran to the study, waving the envelope in her hand as Brian looked up from his desk. "I got in," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with joy. Brian stood, pulling her into a tight hug. "I knew you would," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You've earned this." Donna joined them moments later, her smile wide as she embraced Ashley. "You're going to do amazing things," she said. "I just know it." As the weeks turned into months, the family found their footing. Brian began restructuring his business, focusing on philanthropic efforts inspired by Donna's story. The mansion, once a place of tension and secrecy, became a sanctuary filled with laughter and love. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Donna raised her glass, her eyes shining with gratitude. "To us," she said, her voice steady. Her voice. "To second chances, and to the future we're building together." Ashley and Brian clinked their glasses against hers, their smiles reflecting the bond they had forged through pain, perseverance, and hope. After dinner, Ashley stepped outside, her gaze drawn to the stars scattered across the night sky. Donna joined her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she leaned against the railing. "You know," Donna said softly, "when I was in Texas, there were nights I'd sit outside and stare at the stars, wondering if you were doing the same thing somewhere." Ashley turned to her, her eyes glistening. "I used to do that too. It made me feel less alone." Donna reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You were never alone, Ashley. Not really. And now, we never have to be again." As the two women stood together under the starlit sky, Ashley felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The road that had brought them here had been long and treacherous, but it had also led them to each other. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As a family, 6 months had passed since the day Calloway was arrested, and the world of Ashley, Brian, and Donna had changed in ways they never imagined. What once felt like an endless storm had given way to a new dawn. Where hope and possibility replaced fear and regret, Ashley stood on the steps of her design school, clutching a portfolio filled with sketches she had poured her heart into. The city buzzed around her, the hum of activity, a backdrop to the new chapter she had embraced. The program had challenged her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she thrived, each design carrying a piece of her journey. Brian had made good on his promise to rebuild his legacy. His company, once driven by profit, had shifted its focus to initiatives that supported victims of abuse and trauma. Under his leadership, a new foundation had been created in Donna's name, offering resources and support to those who had been silenced by fear. As for Donna, her story had become a beacon of resilience. The article detailing her ordeal and survival had gone viral, sparking conversations and inspiring others to come forward with their own stories. She had been invited to speak at events and panels, her voice now a powerful force for change. One evening, the family reunited at the mansion for a dinner that had become their tradition. The house was no longer the cold, imposing structure it once was. It had been transformed into a warm, inviting home, filled with life and laughter. Ashley arrived first, her portfolio tucked under one arm as she greeted Donna with a hug. "You're glowing," Donna said, her smile radiant. "School must be treating you well." "It's amazing," Ashley replied, her excitement palpable. "I can't wait to show you what I've been working on." Brian joined them moments later, carrying a bottle of wine and looking more relaxed than Ashley had ever seen him. "What's this?" he teased, eyeing the portfolio. "Another masterpiece." "You'll see," Ashley said with a grin, setting it on the dining table. Over dinner, they shared stories of their days, laughter filling the room as they recounted memories both old and new. Brian raised a toast, his voice steady but emotional. "To family," he said. "To everything we've endured, and to everything we've built together. I couldn't be prouder of the two of you." Ashley and Donna clinked their glasses against his, their smiles reflecting the strength of the bond they had forged. After dinner, Ashley opened her portfolio, revealing a series of designs inspired by her mother's story. Each piece told a part of the journey: loss, survival, and ultimately, renewal. Donna's eyes filled with tears as she flipped through the sketches. "These are beautiful," she said, her voice trembling. "You've captured something so real." Brian nodded, his pride evident. "The world is going to know your name, Ashley. I'm sure of it." Later that night, as the family gathered in the living room, Donna shared a revelation of her own. "I've been thinking about going back to Texas," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Not to live, but to visit. There are parts of my past I haven't fully made peace with, and I think it's time." Ashley reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "Do you want us to come with you?" Donna smiled, her eyes warm. "No, this is something I need to do on my own. But knowing you're here, waiting for me, makes it a lot less scary." Brian leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "Whatever you need, Donna, we're here for you. Always." As the night wore on, the conversation turned to the future. They talked about dreams, plans, and the lives they were building, each word a testament to the strength they had found in one another. When the evening ended, Ashley stood on the balcony staring at the stars. Donna joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You've come so far," Donna said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Ashley leaned into her mother's embrace, her voice filled with quiet emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you, and without Brian. For the first time, I feel like I know who I am, and I'm not afraid anymore." Donna kissed the top of her head, her own tears glistening in the starlight. "Neither am I." Inside, Brian watched them from the doorway, his heart full. The journey they had been on hadn't been easy, but it had brought them to this moment, a place of healing, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As the family came together one last time that night, the mansion stood as a symbol of their resilience. It was no longer just a house. It was a home, a place where they could dream, grow, and thrive. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring its own challenges, they knew they would face it together, stronger than ever.